Thanks all for coming on this beautiful sunny Friday afternoon. I am so pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Julia Parrish. She comes down from University of Washington. She is in both the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences and the Department of Biology. She's been at UW since 1990. She has a PS in biology from Carnegie Mellon. She got her PhD at Duke in zoology. She is interested in marine conservation in general, but how she gets at those kinds of questions is studying the behavior, ecology, and conservation of coastal seabirds. You might have noticed on the poster that seabird was not looking very frisky at that time. So anyway, so part of her work has to do with issues of seabird bycatching fisheries. Now, the things that you can find by poking around on the internet. So Dr. Parrish was she was an art major to begin with, and then she had a transformative experience at the Duke Marine Biology Lab. So perhaps some of you are on task to have a transformative experience this summer or soon if you haven't already had it. She also was named Year of the Ocean Environmental Hero, and this had to do with developing the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team, which is a citizen science project. So I think you're going to hear lots of interesting things this afternoon. So we'll welcome Dr. Parrish and turn it over.
So can you guys hear me? This is like the closest I've ever gotten to be Madonna. Thanks. Thank you, Romy. I'm really, really glad to be down here, and I'm amazed that y'all are in here on this fabulous Friday. So I'll try and make it interesting and exciting. I am extremely excited about dead birds, but I realize that is kind of a geeky thing, and maybe all of you don't share that same passion, at least right now. So one of my aims today is to convert you all to dead bird aficionados. Okay. Great. I don't know whether we can dim the lights a little bit. You know, there's always that interaction between if the lights are too low, it's too warm, everybody goes to sleep. But we'll see. Okay, so I titled this talk The Natural History of Dead Birds, which sounds pretty odd because, of course, in order to do natural history, you do that on live things, not dead things. But in my work in the last year or so, we've been really thinking a lot about the long-term and large-scale signals that dead birds can send us as a group, just looking at pattern. And here I'm looking at a particular kind of dead birds. I'm looking at dead birds that wash up on a beach. So there are all sorts of other kinds of dead birds that you hear about, but I'm just looking at one particular kind. And I look on beaches, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. So this is a picture taken out of Neah Bay, which is right at the tip of the Olympic Peninsula. And Neah Bay has been inhabited for a very long period of time. This is a picture from the UW archives, and it's showing Native American women preparing a salmon bake. So this is a picture that was taken at least a century and a half ago. This is a picture of two Makah tribal members getting a harpoon ready to go whaling. And in fact, one of the guys in this picture is the grandfather of one of the tribal members who participates in my dead bird program. And this is a picture also taken from Neah Bay of the tribe outfluencing a gray whale. So there's a lot of controversy about 10 years ago in the news about the Makah tribe wanting to start whaling again, and a lot of people said, well, they don't need it, they don't do it, they don't know how to do it. But these pictures and many, many others clearly prove that this is a tribe that's been living very close to the land and the marine environment for a long period of time. And in fact, lots of tribal members have. This is a picture of a tribal member, probably Quileute or Quinault, on the Copalis National Wildlife Refuge, and he's holding a tufted puffin, which he just took out of a burrow. We call that grubbing out of a burrow. So there are a lot of people that have been interested in marine life and the seabirds on the outer coast of Washington for a long time. This is a modern day shot of the island that I have spent the last about 22 years of my life working on. This is Tatoosh Island, and it's at the northwest tip of the Olympic Peninsula. So if you were on a ship and you were sailing into Puget Sound, you would sail into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and you would pass this island and you would see that lighthouse on the island. That lighthouse has been there for a long time. It was finished in 1855, making it one of the oldest buildings in Washington State. Amazing. And they had to haul every single stone and every single brick and window and everything else up that cliff by hand in order to build that island. You're looking at a picture of what is known as a potlatch, or a gathering of all of the families on the beach for basically for a festival. And as the sun went down, a party. Potlatches were outlawed by the governor of the territory at the time. That was Governor Stevens. But the macaw came out to Tatoosh and continued that tradition, and they do today. This is a picture that we took quite recently of what's now known as Tribal Journey, which is a gathering of many of the tribal members, each sporting their own canoes. Some of the canoes on some tribal journeys come from as far away as Hawaii, and they are paddle sailed from Hawaii to the coast. So these guys are pretty hardcore. We are not hardcore. We live in this small little house on Tatoosh. It houses just about everything that we do. It's known as the Winter Palace. And this is inside the Winter Palace, and you can just see all of the things that we do, including, I love this picture on the lower right. That's a pie just about to go into our tiny little white gas stove oven. My graduate student at the time referred to it as skunk poop pie because it's full of berries from the island. So most of the time we're not in the Winter Palace cooking, we're out on the island looking at what's going on, and we look at seabirds. This is the species that I do most of my work on. This is the common murre. There is no uncommon murre, there's just a common murre, and there's a northern relative up in Alaska called the thick-billed murre. And murres are pretty amazing animals. You can see in flight they sort of look like a football with wings, so they lose their neck completely. Let me show you that again. Neck, no neck. And you can see that that bird is really aerodynamically shaped. It literally looks like a football, and it's got a point at either end, so it could, I guess, fly backwards if it could switch its wings around. It has pretty short wings, not very, very long wings like an albatross, but short wings, and they're pretty broad. And that's because this bird is made to not only fly in the air, but also fly underwater. So if you've ever been, how many people have been to the Monterey Bay Aquarium? How many people? So if you go to the big bay tank there and there's a bird that zips by you really fast, it's that bird. It's a common murre. So they fly to several hundred meters underwater. We know this because they've been caught in gill nets that are set on the bottom. They're called set nets, so they are weighted and they float up from the bottom. And murres have been caught in set nets that are over 250 meters deep. So they can go anywhere on the shelf. They're basically like a salmon or a lingcod. On Tatoosh, they nest in two different kinds of habitats. They nest in the crevice that is built into the vertical cliff wall, and there they smash in just about as many murres as you can fit. And they also nest on the top of the island there in under the salmonberry. And you can see here in this picture, there are quite a few murres. There's about 2,500 murres in that picture. Kind of amazing. And they're just literally shoulder to shoulder. And how do we study them? We spend a lot of time hanging out on the edge of vertical cliffs. So this is a point that I spend a lot of time sitting on. You can see that the chair that I'm sitting on is very low, and that might look comfortable. It's actually not. It really hurts your back. But if you sit in a high chair, the wind will actually blow you off the cliff. And so that's not such a good strategy. So I tend to be low, hanging out with the gulls and my spotting scope. And here's my view. I'm looking south here, and you can see see that cliff is the one that I just showed you a picture of. And way off in the distance, it looks like there's a spire right sticking up behind that cliff. That's Foucault Pillar, which was and still is, in fact, a navigation landscape form. And when we're trying to look at those nesting areas that are on the cliff top, we not only rely on our view from the edge, we also build these blinds. Now, I'm used to say that these are about the size of a phone booth and a half, but with digital era, nobody knows what a phone booth is anymore, so it's about half the size of this table. And it has, it's basically a plywood box, a very hot plywood box. Perhaps you're beginning to think that you don't want to do seabird biology. And it's got windows. It's got 3 windows. And so here you're sitting in the blind and you're looking out the windows. This is one of my field assistants who now runs my citizen science program. You can see her in the dark on the left-hand side just taking notes. And you can see that the birds are right up close to the windows. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay, so this is a video, and I guess the sound isn't working. You'll just have to imagine the sound. And you can see that there's a bird there that doesn't know it's a window. And it's trying to get in. No worries. And why is it doing that? Well, this glass is like the special glass I have in police TV shows. It's one-way mirrored glass. So if we're in the blind, we see the MERS, right, and they see themselves. And they really like what they see, so you can see that they nest right up against the blind. So we get a really good view of sex and violence in the seabird world. It's very noisy, it's extremely smelly, and we can see all sorts of things. And we certainly have over the years. We can also open the windows, and that's fun. We can play literally Alien Space Invader by waiting until night and slowly opening the windows and reaching out with a special tool and literally grabbing a MER and bringing it in the blind. Yes, it's an Area 51 kind of strategy. And then we can put a hood over that MER and we can take it to our special spaceship laboratory, Winter Palace, where we can do all sorts of things to that bird. For instance, we can put radio or satellite transmitters on the bird. We can take all sorts of weights and measurements of blood samples, and then we can put the bird in a special tunnel that takes it back out into the colony. And you can imagine what it says to its neighbors as it settles back down over its egg. Okay, so here's a little bit about the natural history of MERS. They're the densest nesting bird in the world. Females lay 1 egg and 1 egg only at a time, right on the substrate. So they don't build a nest; they dispense with that. And the egg's about 15% of the body weight of the female. That's substantially larger than a human baby, and so that's why I think they only lay 1 egg at a time, because the female doesn't want to go through that again and takes a year to forget. So both the female and the male take turns incubating that egg. After about 30 days, that egg will hatch, and both males and females will go out fishing. They bring 1 fish back at a time. It's always head in, tail out. So we have developed a very extensive key to fish butts over the years. This, for instance, is a rockfish. And after getting fed, these fish for about 2.5 to 3 weeks, sometimes 3.5 weeks, the chick will look like this. It's about 1/3 of adult size. It's taken on a winter plumage coloration, so you can see if you look at the cheek, the side of the face of that chick, it's slightly different. The white is higher on the face than the adults. So one evening, just after sunset, the chick will get it into its mind that it wants to walk through the colony to the edge of the cliff and literally leap off. Now, you'd think that this was a dinosaur waiting to happen strategy, because they don't have flight feathers yet. So this is a bird that's literally falling off a cliff and can't fly. And that cliff might be 150, 170 feet in height, and there are rocks at the bottom. Don't try this yourself. But if you were a very small chick, about the size of a very fuzzy tennis ball, and you lobbed yourself off the cliff, you'll reach terminal velocity without going very fast. So when you hit the bottom, it's okay. You don't mush the way you would, or I would. You literally pick yourself up and shake off, and you make a special cry, cheep, cheep, cheep. That's the mer chick fledgling cry, cheep, cheep, cheep. And Dad goes, oh, I hear my kid. And Dad can recognize the voice of his and only his chick. He flies down to the water, and Dad and chick swim off together. And they will stay together for 2 or 3 months while he teaches the chick how to fish. Once the chick has got it, they part ways, and that chick will go off on its own for somewhere between 4 and 15 years before it returns back to the colony it was born at to find a mate and start that cycle all over again. So that's a little bit about the natural history of MERS. I want to tell you just a teeny little bit about ecology of MERS, and then I want to weave that story into a larger picture of seabirds. So one of the things that we do when we sit in that blind is look and see what fish are brought back. Remember the rockfish picture that I showed you? So we've literally looked at about 30,000 fish butts over the years, and we record what species, we record a whole bunch of other things about them. This is a graphic that just shows you species. So on the x-axis you're seeing years, and on the y-axis you're seeing a percent of the total diet that we saw in that year. That's a particular kind of fish. So the dark blue bars on the bottom are herring. That's a fish that occurs every year, and the medium darkish green bars are surf smelt. They occur in a lot of years, although they winked out in mid-aughts, about between 05 and 06. There are no bars in 07 and 08, and that's because there was no breeding on the island in 07 and 08. So this just shows you a few things. One is MERS eat a lot of different things. Anything that's about pizza-sized fish, like an anchovy, they'll eat, and there's a lot of different things that you can eat there. And so that's kind of interesting, because that means that even as the ecosystem is changing quite a lot and there are new fish coming in, the MERS can really shift their diet a lot. But it turns out that's not the whole story. It's not just what you eat, it's how often you bring food back and how big those fish are. So some really big fish are going to have more energy than the same species really small. Right? A big herring is a better meal than a small herring. And some species are really energy rich and some are energy poor. So there's a fish up there, it's a type of smelt, Eulachon is the name of it, and the macaw called it candlefish, and that's because when dried and stuck in oil, you could literally light this fish. It was a wick. And so very, very, very high energy. So if you can eat Eulachon, you're doing really well. If you have to eat little baby cod, you're not doing so well at all. So you have to eat a lot of cod to get up to 1 Eulachon. And so we can look at different years relative to how quickly the adults are bringing back fish. That's provisioning rate on the y-axis. And we can look at energy per fish. That is what a good meal looks like on the x-axis. And I've redone this so that to the left or down is lower than average, and to the right or up is higher than average, right? So the middle point where those axes cross is basically normal. And you can see a few things. You can see that in some years, the green years, the good years, there's a lot of high energy per fish, and they're delivered really fast, right? It's a good year, those chicks get out, they leave with dad, like that picture I showed you. In some years, things are really bad, low energy per fish, and they're not delivered very often. The chicks, well, in fact, the adults will often abandon. They'll abandon eggs, or they'll abandon their chicks. Their breeding is really low, and the adults are having a hard time. We find them dead on the beach. That's that picture on the lower left. In some years, the compensation years, in which energy per fish is low, it's not a good meal year, it's a sort of Twinkie, not a steak year, but the provisioning rate is really high, so the parents are compensating by bringing back food really, really fast, right? And so in those years, we see there's breeding, but a lot of the chicks don't make it because they're really thin, right? So they're wimpy little chicks, and they get out there on the water with dad, and dad's pretty thin too. So a winter storm comes along, and we don't see them a lot. So what we see alive and what we see dead on the beach can actually tell us a lot about what happened on the breeding colony, even if we aren't on the breeding colony. Now, these data come from our breeding colony, but we have other data that suggest these patterns of how many murres we find on the beach, and whether they're adults or chicks or both, really synchronizes very, very well with what's going on in the colony. So that was our first clue that we could look at the natural history of dead birds, right? We could look at the patterns, how many, what, where, when. Those are basic natural history things of dead stuff, and allow that to tell us something about what's going on the colony. So here's just a seasonal graphic of murre breeding. So I have all of the months, and I've divided them into the seasons, which you can see along the x-axis, and I've drawn some dashed lines there to just separate the seasons out so you can get a sense there. And I want you to look at the words first. These are just telling us something about what's going on with the murre. So they arrive in about May, they lay eggs in June, those eggs hatch in July, those chicks fledge in August, and dads and chicks and moms who get out of town all disperse sometime between September and October. So that's normal for Washington. I put in a little error there to remind myself to tell you that murres breed all the way down to the middle of California. And in California, things are shifted earlier, which makes sense, right? It gets warmer in California earlier. So cherry blossoms start earlier in California, and so do murres, about 2 months earlier. Now, what are those S-shaped lines that I've drawn? Those are physical measures of the strength of upwelling. That's literally whether the top water right at the coast is moving offshore, and in a case when it moves offshore, water from below wells up to replace it, hence the name upwelling. That deep water is cold, which is why it's cold right close to the shore, and it's also full of nutrients, right? So upwelling is a good thing. It's sort of the turbo boost to the coastal ecosystem. And upwelling, when it happens, starts in the spring and happens through the summer. So we have seasonal upwelling in the Pacific Northwest. The upper line there is southern Oregon, and the purplish line is northern Washington, right at Tetouche. And then when the murres are leaving, upwelling shifts and it goes to downwelling. So the wind reverses, and the water starts to move onshore, and storms start to come in the fall, right? That's the restart of the rainy season. That's why if you're going to get married, do it by about September 15th, right? Before that grass switches, otherwise have your ceremony inside. That's the relationship between culture and oceanography. So that timing and where the murres are choosing to breed is set by the physics of the system in the Pacific Northwest. Now that's really cool to think about, right? Because normally, you take an oceanography class, we're learning about upwelling and downwelling and all of this stuff, Ekman transport, all the little arrows that go everywhere, and you can't relate that at all to biology. But in fact, coastal biology takes as its cue what's going on in the system. So these two systems, the physical system and the biological system, are very, very tightly linked. What normally happens, again, when the murres are going through that whole cycle, what are the adults doing? They are really trying to get a kid out. Remember, because there's one egg. So they have all their investment for the year in one kid. So sometimes they're bringing back a fish and they're not feeding themselves. They're actually losing weight. It's hard to be a parent, and all of the parents in the room sitting in the back, I know you can attest to this, right? Why do your professors who have just had a kid have very dark circles under their eyes? Because they're not sleeping, because they're spending all their time trying to tend their kid. And seabirds, and in fact all animals, are no different. It's stressful to reproduce. And you put a lot of investment into those kids because you want to get them to a place where they're independent, right? This is why your parents are paying for your college. So you can think about fledging in seabirds just that way. So right when the fall transition is happening, right when the nutrients are leaving the system and we're the storms are starting to roll in, adult MERS are at their weakest point, right? And if there's a storm at the wrong time, really messing up their ability to forage, they're going to die. And they're going to wash up on the beach. So this pattern here, the pattern of the natural history of the live birds and the physics of the system, gives us a prediction about when we should find dead birds on the beach. And it should be in the fall. Okay, now, I wasn't thinking all of that stuff when I started our Dead Bird program. This is the logo of our Dead Bird program, and our program is called the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team, or COAST, with 2 S's. It's very, very important that you have a memorable acronym. Otherwise, nobody's going to remember you, right? It's a little less important about your logo. We had a long, interesting time trying to figure out the logo of the Dead Bird program. You can only imagine some of the early versions. So COAST is what we call a rigorous citizen science program. It's headquartered at the University of Washington, and we partner with all sorts of different organizations and agencies. And in COAST, we train participants to survey beaches. And we are using beach gas birds, or dead birds, to monitor environmental quality. Okay. Now, why do we use seabirds as indicators? Well, one is there's a whole bunch of different species that are utilizing the system, not just MERS, but lots and lots of other ones. In fact, I should dial up this number 100, as I'll show you in a minute. And seabirds are pretty long-lived. So some seabirds, like albatross and their relatives, the fulmars, that I'll talk about in a minute, they will live 60 or 70 years. So they have a lifespan that is longer than most of humanity in third world countries. I kid you not. That is an amazing thing. It also means that if you're going to study them as graduate students, you need to ask a short-term question, not a long natural history one. Okay, so who is COAST? COAST is a whole bunch of different people who work for and with me, including Jane Delver, Liz Mack, and Charlie Bright in the COAST office. Lots and lots of student interns, and they all look fabulously wonderful like this. And we also have a coordinator at the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. COAST is mainly volunteers, quite a few of them. They do all sorts of things, or did all sorts of things in life. They're kind of on the old side. Their average age is 58, and that's because we have a preponderance of retirees in the program. And retirees, one, have a lot of time, and two, know what they want to do. So they'll spend a lot of time working for a program if they are convinced that you're doing something good. But we have a wide age range, 7 to 93. We're more women than men. I tend to think that's because women are smarter, and that's true, of course. But they also last longer. That is to say, the average age of women, so women last on average about 15 years longer than men. And we won't go into that. You can just ponder that for yourself. Here's where COAST is. So I've colored the map of the West Coast. You might note I've cut Canada out of the picture. And that's not because I don't like Canada. I really like Canada. It's because we don't actually run the program in Canada. It's a sister program. So we start in Humboldt County. That's that sort of purple-bluish region down the coast of California. We run up the outer coast to the tip of the Olympic Peninsula where Tatoosh is. We come inside, we pick up Puget Sound, we leap to southeast Alaska, pick up the Gulf, go out the Aleutians, hop over into the Bering Sea, and then up into the Chukchi Sea. So we are vast. And this is just a map of a bunch of our sites in Washington. Here's how COAST works. We recruit and train local citizens in their locality, so we don't make them fly to the University of Washington to be trained. We go there, and that means that we're on the road doing a training, a refresher, a social event for our volunteers, or a talk like this one, just about every week of the year. About every 5 to 6 days, somebody from the office is out doing something. When we're doing trainings, we give our volunteers a protocol, a field guide, and data sheets. And the data sheets are here. Here's our field guide. We'll talk about that in a minute. Here's our website, www.coast.org. And in fact, our volunteers enter their data into the website where we verify it. And then we give it back out in a whole range of outputs. These are our annual reports, our newsletters, our Coast cards, and right here, they're too small really to be seen, are our non-denominational holiday cards from a Dead Bird program. These are some of our biggest sellers even now. In fact, yesterday we received the first email from our volunteers. This happens every year. Really looking forward to the holiday card. And I'm thinking, it's April, isn't it April? Do I have to really stress about the holiday card now? Didn't we just put one out? So if you join Coast, you get among all of the other things, including rigorous training, to be on the mailing list and get the holiday card. Okay. So why do dead birds, why not live birds, dead birds, how geeky is that? There are a lot of them in some places, especially, for instance, along the outer coast of Washington and Oregon. And of course they were once alive and they died of something. And unlike a live bird, a dead bird can be identified by anybody. And that is because it will patiently wait for you to find it, right? You don't have to get up in the morning. You don't have to buy a Swarovski spotting scope for $1,700. You don't have to wear that weird camo outfit that you can buy at Cabela's, right? You don't have to do any of that. You don't have to sit in the blind that's hot and smelly like I do. You can just take a walk on the beach. And you don't have to sneak up on them either. They can be thoroughly examined. You can pick them up. They will not mind if you do that. Unlike a live bird that's likely to try and poke your eye out because it thinks you're a predator. And also, unlike live birds, dead birds can be very easily photographed. In fact, you can pose a dead bird in the photograph so that it fills the frame, right? Unlike any of you birders out there that are also photographers, how many of you have taken what I refer to as speck photographs, right? So you see a bird that you really think is cool, you go to take a picture of it, and you see the picture, and it's like, see that speck? That was the eagle, right? And everybody's saying, what speck? Right? So dead birds, you can take a full frame photograph. And collectively, they can contain a lot of valuable information. So the first thing that you need to do in a dead bird program is identify the birds, right? And you have to know that you've done it right. So you need a field guide. And I really wish this was our field guide. It's not. Our field guide looks like this. We now actually have 3 separate field guides, one to the West Coast, that's this one, it's just about to go into its 4th printing, one for Alaska, and we have another one for the North Atlantic. So we're slowly taking over the world with respect to dead bird field guides. And our Alaska guide has been translated into Cyrillic because we have some sites in Russia. So the dead bird identification starts with the feet. This is the participatory part of this lecture. So, in fact, if you look at the foot key in the guide, you can see the first question, are the front toes free, lobed, or webbed? So, with respect to this picture here and this particular foot, what is the answer? You guys are so awake. You are on it. And so, in fact, this tells you yes, they're webbed, and also what question to go to. You go to that question, and you get the second question. If webbed, is the webbing complete or marginal? And here you can look at 2 diagrams. Complete webbing, which shows you sometimes the webbing will fade back a little bit for a dried out, mummified foot. Or this other foot here that belongs to partially webbed shorebirds. So for this foot, which is it? Complete or marginal? Complete. I can hear you are gaining confidence already, and that tells you to go to question 7. Here's a tricky question, it has 3 answers. If completely webbed, does the foot have 3 or 4 toes? And your choices are 3 webbed, 4 webbed, or 3 webbed with the 4th toe free. Which one is it? 4 webbed. Okay, so without any seabird training, and I'm assuming that there are novice seabirders here in the audience here, yes? Okay. you've gotten to the right foot type family, and that is pouch bills. So every identification starts with the feet. You get to the foot type family, then you take 3 measurements of the bill, basically from the hairline to the tip of the bill, of the wing, from the wrist to the tip of the longest primary, and of the ankle bone, from the ankle to the top of the toes. That gives you 3 more pieces of evidence, and then you take a photograph. You can see how lovely it is posing a dead bird in that photograph. With these pieces of information, you, the volunteer, can make an identification using the guide, and we in the Coast Office can independently verify that you are correct. And that is super important, because that means that we can take your data and we can pass it directly into science and resource management, because it is believable, because we can prove it. That is rigorous citizen science. And here's how rigorous it is. Our volunteers get to species about 85% of the time, and we can increase that a little bit up to about 92%. So what's that 15%? Are they getting it wrong? 15% of the time, no, they're just not getting all the way to species. The incorrect rate is about down to about 3%. So that difference, the 12%, difference is when they only say, for instance, it's a large gull without saying what species, or it's a large alcid without telling us whether it's a murre or a gilleye. Okay. And here's what coasters find. This is our top 29 or top 25 through 2009. I'm going to tell you a few stories about these 2 birds, common murres and northern fulmars. They are our top 2 species, and they have very, very different natural history strategies. And they have very different dead bird natural history strategies. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few data slides, but I just want to give you a sense of what we're doing with all those data, with all those volunteers that are out there collecting data. Right now we have about 850 volunteers actively collecting data over about 450 sites. So it's a very, very big program. There's not a day that goes by that we don't get data over the internet. And all of those people are out doing single surveys, and they are identifying all of these birds, B is for bird, going into a survey. And all of those beaches are different lengths. So we have to standardize. We can't just count the number of birds. We have to standardize it. We standardize it by beach lengths. We get birds per kilometer, right? So if you have a 3-kilometer beach, I pity you, especially if you live in Washington or Oregon, because there are a lot of birds, or if you have a 200 or 300 meter little pocket beach, if you're in the San Juan Islands, for instance, we have to standardize that to average birds per kilometer. We also look over several beaches that are occurring within a single region, and we do another average there, so we're getting average birds per kilometer in the region, and that goes into a table that's by year and by month. And we look at the data in 2 ways, carcasses per kilometer, what I've been talking about, but then we also scale that to the maximum month. So imagine you've got a run of 12 months in a year. Some months are going to be high bird months, some birds are going to be low bird, some months are going to be low bird months. And we want to know what's the highest month, and what percent of that month is all other months within the year, right? That allows us to ask, is it the same year in and year out, or is it different? Is it the same from one region to the next, or is it different? Regardless of the actual data max in carcasses per kilometer. And I'll show you both ways. Okay, so here's a graphic where the y-axis is carcasses per kilometer. We call that encounter rate, and that's because we know that our volunteers are missing some birds, right? So they are actually encountering this many carcasses per kilometer. And the area graph here with the 3 humps is all carcasses, regardless of what species they are. And these lines here refer to individual species. Here are the ones I want to concentrate on, common murres and northern fulmars. Now these lines are stacked on top of each other, which means that there's a lot of space between one line and the next. That number of carcasses is the top line. So let's follow this bottom line, northern fulmars. When do they wreck? When do they come up on the beach? In November, December, sometimes January, sometimes back in October, right? Because there's a lot of space between the base and this line. When do murres wreck? Here's the murre space here. They wreck in August, September, and a little bit here in October. But by the winter time, when the fulmars are wrecking, the MERS are done dying, right? Or at least they're done washing in. And they're done washing in, and they're done washing in, and they're done washing in. There's no MERS, no MERS, no MERS. They breed, right? They're arriving. Remember I told you they're arriving here. They're laying their eggs here. The chicks are here. They're starting to fledge, and here they're starting to die, right? So in fact, that prediction that I made when the MERS should die, you can see that that happens here. This is in northern Oregon, so it's a little bit earlier than in Washington. Okay. And in fact, we can look at that same graphic. Here is the one that I just showed you. We can look at it in different places. Here's southern Washington and northern Washington. Here's southern Oregon and northern California. And you can see that same pattern. It's most iconic in northern Oregon, where we have a big peak here. It shifts a little bit in time here and here. This is the post-breeding mortality peak. So if you're a local breeder like MERS, you breed and you die, right? That's it. And in fact, that's a pretty good strategy, right? Die, then breed, not a good strategy, right? So, if you're gonna be a species, you want to breed at least once before you die. That's the salmon strategy, right? Go home, breed, and die. And that's what the MERS are doing. Now, northern fulmars, they breed in Alaska. They're not local breeders, they're migrators. So once they finish breeding, they have a ways to go. They have to fly to get to our coast, and it's a few thousand kilometers. So a big question is, when should they die, right? Should they do the MERS strategy where they're using up all of their energy to get their kid out and then literally falling over if there's a storm? That seems like that would not be such a good strategy. If they bred, they died in Alaska, and then they migrated, and then they died again, right? Here. So a question that we had in Coast is, again, thinking about the natural history of dead birds, what do migrators do, if anything, different from local breeders? Okay, so I've already showed you the local breeding pattern. Go through, right, I'm going to re-show you the common MER pattern. Okay, so these graphs, really bumpy. I've compressed the years here, so here's June, and here's May. Here's Northern California, here's Northern Oregon, and here's Northern Washington. And each line is a different year. You can tell we haven't had as many years in Northern Oregon because there are fewer lines. This is a percent of max graph. So for each line, 1 point on that line is going to be up at 100%, right? And all other points on that line are going to fall off from 100%. So what can you say here? You can say that if you're a MER, you're going to end up on the beach post-breeding. You're going to finish breeding in Northern California a little before Northern Oregon, a little before Northern Washington. And Northern Washington, there are more weirdnesses. So here is the normal pattern. But there are strange years, like 2011, right? Where there was a peak in the winter. Shouldn't have seen that. And here, this is 2006, where there was a sort of echo peak in the spring. We shouldn't have seen that either. So when we think about the natural history of dead birds, there are times when we expect to see dead birds, and we know that everything is right with the system. And there are times when we see anomalies and everything is wrong with the system. And let me just show you fulmars. So here are northern fulmars. These are the guys that are breeding in Alaska. I'm going to show you that same kind of plot, except I'm going to color it by the seasons here. So just remember, summer is orange, fall is dark red, winter cold is blue, and spring, of course, is green. So these are the quattro stagioni plots that you're going to see. And I'm going to show you a whole bunch of these colored like this, and the bars are going to be fulmar percent of max month in a whole bunch of different places. Okay, so here's that map I showed you before, and each one of these graphics goes to a different place. So I'll just walk you through this. What happens in the Bering Sea? Well, they actually do die a little bit at the end of the breeding season. Now these are percent of max graphs, so what you can't tell from this graph is this peak, although it's the biggest, at that time of year in the Bering Sea is really, really small. So when you look at it in carcasses per kilometer, not percent of max within the region, it's very small. So you get a tiny little bump of mortality of fulmars right at the end of their breeding season up there, almost in the Arctic. And then what do? They fly simultaneously, smearing all the way down the west coast. And you can see, look at all of those other places. Washington, Oregon, California, and these data from Monterey Bay are courtesy of a sister program of ours. So that's when we get the maximum mortality of fulmars, right? And in fact, again, what I'm not showing you is the absolute value. These are very, very high. I think I have a graph of that in a minute. You can also see, and this is kind of interesting to us, there's a little echo boom in the spring. Now this is something that we just started to see after about 2005. So for the first years of our program, we didn't see this at all. So this is a relatively new thing. That's the wrong time of year to die, right? So when you are a migrator, why migrate? Well, who the heck wants to live out in the marine environment in Alaska in the wintertime, right? You want to get to a nicer place. So you come down here, you overwinter. What do? You mulch your feathers, you eat a lot. It's sort of like Thanksgiving and Christmas for about 3.5 months, maybe 4 months. You get fat and sassy because, think about it, ladies, you're about to fly back to the colony and lay an egg, right? You want to be in peak body condition to do that. And gentlemen, you have to defend your ladies. So if you are in wimpy condition, somebody else will come along and literally kick sand in your reproductive face, and you will not have a chick for that year, right? So you want to be in really strong body condition. You don't want to be dying in the spring. So we're a little bit concerned about what's going on in that echo boom. Okay, I did intimate to you that there were differences in the actual absolute value. So this is what we call a heartbeat graph. It's where the months just keep going on and on and on. So each one of these little blips is the peak in a different year. You can see that this graph is entirely structured by this one point. This is fulmars on the beach in 2004, when we had a humongous wreck, that's a whole bunch of dead birds coming on shore at once, of fulmars. People were literally knee-deep in fulmars. Like this picture shows. And so when you look at the absolute values, you can see there's some big years. And the major peak that we see in Washington and Oregon is at that time in the fall. Okay, so I've spoken a little bit about when things are an anomaly. Let me show you a picture of when things are wrong. So this is should be a familiar graphic to you now. There are 3 lines in the 3 different regions, in those months. I'm changing it up. Every time I show you a graph, I switch up which one starts and stops. So you're going to have to be able to count to 12 and translate. I know it's tough. Okay, but here we are starting in March. And you can see there's that big peak, that's the post-breeding peak, and that's happening right after the breeding season. Here's what happened in 2005. In 2005, in those same 3 areas, I'm looking at things a little bit differently. So here are the months. I've changed it again. Here's January, right? So we want to see a bunch of birds, murs washing up on the beach here, and we do see that in northern Oregon. This is positive, more than normal. This is negative, less than normal. But look here in Washington, we had a negative. And in fact, this is when we got the mortality. We had mortality of murs in the spring. So they washed up on the beaches in spring. That is before the breeding season. That year it was die, then breed. But you can't, you're already dead. Right? So in that year what happened was we saw a bunch of mortality here. And the guys that didn't die were in really poor body condition. So they just skipped that year. We had no breeding in Washington, and hence we had no post-breeding mortality because there were no murs on the colony. So again, the natural history of dead birds tells us in this year, wow, there's something really wrong with the ecosystem in that year. It happened that was a year of very, very late spring transition and uproar. Okay, let's see. I have one more story I want to just sneak in here. Okay, I do. I want to tell you one last dead bird story, and this is not about a dominant player, this is about a minor player in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, two of them, surf scoters and white-winged scoters. These are birds that breed up in Alaska and the Northern Territories, and they come down to the West Coast and the East Coast to overwinter. They're ducks, they lay a lot of eggs. They winter along here, and when they arrive, they molt. Okay, so what we know from the Fulmar story is you breed, you save energy enough to migrate, you get there, you die. And then those of you who don't die fatten up and you fly back and you start the cycle again. Okay, so here's what these scoters are doing. And in 1 year, we normally see maybe 10, 15, maybe 20 scoters altogether in the program. But in this year, we saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scoters on the beach, all up and down the Washington coast. So these are data from the affected area where we were finding scoters, about 30 scoters per kilometer. This is what the average was across the whole northern coast, and this is what it normally is in that same place. So lots and lots and lots of scoters. And we did a model that showed where along the coast and what time period. We had a huge big peak in about a week in September across about 77 kilometers of coastline. And we can use a mathematical technique to show us, to ask how many were there. And we got a pretty high number, about 6,000 scoters on the beach, plus or minus about 200. And that's a pretty tight confidence interval. So what happened? In that period of time, there was a lot of foam that was coming up on the beach, and the foam was produced by this guy. This is a dinoflagellate, Akashiwo sanguinea. It was blooming, so that means there was a lot of cells in the water column. And it's the fall, right? So the scoters are coming down to overwinter, and what do migratory birds do when they get where they're going? They molt their flight feathers, right? So, pardon the pun, this makes scoters sitting ducks, right? They cannot fly. They have a catastrophic molt. They lose all of their flight feathers at the same time. So, they're stuck in the water. They can swim under the water, they can get out on the shore, but they can't fly away. This is also the time when the storms are coming in. So Akashiwo is blooming, and it was blooming so much, it literally sucked all of the nutrients out of the water. What happens to a dinoflagellate bloom when it has no more nutrients feeding it? What happens to a plant when you take all the nutrients away? It dies, right? And that's what happens to these cells. They get very unhealthy, and when they experience compression, they break open like eggs. And they put their cell contents out into the water, it gets whipped up, it looks like this. But these guys have a special soap-like quality, and when you put feathers into that foam, they compress. So literally these sitting ducks, right, can't fly away, no flight feathers, get foamed, get slime, and that literally causes all their feathers to basically stop their insulative value, right? It's as if you took a down pillow and you wet it so that the water got right through. And the water's cold, right? So these guys are dying of exposure. They have to get out of the water, they're going to die, right? And they get out of the water onto land, and it's not much better, right? So these guys died of exposure, thousands and thousands of them, because of this harmful algal bloom. So this was the right time of year, but the wrong species. Right? It's a species that we don't normally see dying in those numbers. So again, once again, we were looking at the natural history of those birds to see what was going on. And in fact, that death was the single largest mortality event ascribed to a harmful algal bloom anywhere in the world ever. Amazing, amazing numbers. So I hope I've convinced you with my stories of murres and fulmars and now scoters that the natural history of dead birds really is an exciting and interesting thing. And even though I think that you're probably all privately thinking, ooh, Julia, can I go out dead birding with you? And you're just too shy to admit it. I know. You can, in fact, join our program. We have sites in mid and southern Puget Sound, and we would be more than happy to do a dead bird training down here so you guys could get up close and personal with the natural history of dead birds. Thank you very much for listening. The question is, have I seen any long-term changes in the Murre life cycle due to climate change? That's a fabulous question. Certainly over the last 25 years or so, we have seen Murre breeding be pushed back. So in Washington, when I started, the first eggs were laid right at the beginning of June. In an extraordinary year, we'd see the first eggs at the end of May. Now we see the first eggs in the 20s in June. And so one interpretation of that is that it's a climate signal. Another interpretation of that is that it's the effect of predators. So another thing that's happened over that quarter of a century, gosh, it makes me so old to say that, is that the main predator on the colonies of Murre's bald eagles have really increased their numbers. Right? That's a conservation success story, certainly across the entire country. But in the Pacific Northwest, we've seen a great increase in the number of eagles and also of peregrine falcons. And those guys start breeding in April. So another interpretation of that shift is that the Murres are trying to push their breeding as late as possible so that the eagles fledge their kids and get out of the system. And right now we don't have the ability to tell the difference because the experiment, of course, is to do a predator removal, right? You remove all the predators from the system and you see if the prey bounces back. But that is somewhere between illegal and unconscionable. So, yeah.
Do you know why that one year had such a big bloom for the
Akashi one?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. So in general, if you take a biological oceanography course, you'll find that there's two blooms. The spring bloom, usually diatoms, those are those little single-cell algae that end up in pool filters as diatomaceous earth. And in the fall, we see a bloom of dinoflagellates. And that's a pretty standard pattern. But there are lots and lots of different species of each of those. And so although we know in general, diatoms are going to go off in the spring and dinos are going to go off in the fall, it's very hard to predict which species. Akashiwo is a species that likes slightly warmer water, and it can deal with slightly less than full-strength salinity. So it likes a little less than full strength and it likes warmer water. And it tolerates a very broad range of conditions, and when it's in conditions that are even marginally optimal for it, it goes very fast. So that fall was, that September was anomalously warm. We had very, very warm surface waters all along the Washington coast. And so we think that it was that probably set the Akashiwo off. We also have some evidence that suggests that once the species Akashiwo gets in the system and has bloomed once, which we see here, it's more likely to bloom again. And we don't know why that is. But statistics suggest that that is true. So we're kind of waiting to see whether that's going to happen again, because you would suggest as a last person also suggested with climate change that we might expect to see a shift in sea surface temperatures. So it may be moving towards conditions that favor that species. We'll just have to wait and see. Right? Yeah.
You know, the unexpected mortality events with the Murre, do you have a sense of what had happened there? Sort of the late mortality events that were outside of that winter mortality?
Yeah, we got a really, we had one in 2011, and that year was an extremely quiescent fall. So what we think actually happened is there was literally no major post-breeding peak in that year. It was shifted into the winter. So it was also smaller than than normal. So if you looked at it in absolute numbers from year to year, the 2011 peak is small. So there are years every now and then when fall is extended. We get an Indian summer. I believe that was the year when we didn't actually get summer, and we didn't get summer until about August, and then it just kept going and going and going. It went through into October and actually on into November. That would have been a great year to get married. And then storms hit in the winter. So I think that winter peak was just a mop-up of who didn't die in the fall. Yeah. Good question. What's the time commitment? Hours and hours and hours. I mean, never let you out. The average poster in this part of the country probably puts in 30 to 40 hours a year, I would say. We require people to go out on the beach monthly, and that's because, we need to look and see what the pattern is all year. So if you only do 3 months out of the year, then you literally don't know what's going on in your site and the rest of the time. So it's sometimes hard for students, especially if you have a seasonal cycle, right? You're somewhere for 9 months, or somewhere else for 3 months. But we do have sites that are manned by student teams, in fact, by different universities from Humboldt State in Eureka, Arcata, all the way on up to the University of Alaska. So that's something to think about. And also, we request that people survey in pairs, and that's for a lot of reasons. Safety is an obvious one of them. Also, and you probably know this, if you've ever had a lab, you take a lab, you have a lab partner. Why do you have a lab partner? You have a lab partner so that you can say, I don't know, do you know? Right? And that's a good thing to say. I can sense you said that. That's something that you can say on the beach as well. Great, well, if anybody has